There's the dispensation of grace that's going on. And then we saw that we're not appointed to wrath. What's going on in this time, we're not appointed to wrath. We're delivered from the wrath to come. We're saved from wrath through him, or by him, saved by his life. And so we're not going to go through that day of wrath, and therefore there's a resurrection in connection with what Christ is doing today, what God is doing today in the dispensation of the grace of God. And that resurrection, we saw a unique difference, that we're going to be caught up in the air. Well, according to Zechariah 14, he's going to stand upon the Mount of Olives. And the resurrection at that point hasn't even taken time. There's a great battle that takes place, as we saw there in Zechariah 14. And so there's a difference in what's going on. And we pointed that out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back and concern ourselves with this resurrection, number 3 and number 4. When we first looked at them, they were number 2 and number 3, but now in view of the mystery resurrection, the rapture, being caught up, it's number 3 and number 4. By the way, the reason why that's the case, and I can't get into it in great detail, but I'll bring it up by way of passing. Here we're caught up together with him, with the Lord in the clouds in the air. And what you have is our vocation and calling with what God's doing today in this dispensation of grace is in the heavenly places. And there's a resurrection as it concerns the earth. Now, the reason why the mystery resurrection takes place before the first earthly resurrection is because of the judgment against the adversary. The adversary, Lucifer, when he fell, he became Satan, the adversary of God, and we read about in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. What we realize is that when he fell, he trafficked that iniquity that was found in him. He trafficked it in the sanctuaries there in the heavenly places. The first realm in which the adversary usurped was the heavenly places. We know that as well in Romans chapter 5 when it says sin entered the world and death by sin. That means sin was in existence prior to it entering the world, entering in the earth with man. And that's who had it. We know the serpent there beguiled Eve, that serpent, that Satan, that old serpent. He was the one that was the father of the lie. He's the father of sin, that iniquity that was found in him. Because by the reason of his brightness, he was corrupted and all these kind of things against God. And that's where he usurped dominion. He is identified in view of that usurpation in Ephesians chapter 2. Again, I'm just giving this to you as the prince of the power of the air. He has authority in the heavenly places. And that's a title that he holds in connection with that. In view of sin entering the world and death by sin and his usurping the authority on this earth, he has a title called the Prince of this world, the Prince of the world, the God of this world. And the first realm, however, is where he usurped first was the heavenly places. So the very first realm that God is going to reconcile back to himself is the heavenly places. The second realm in which this adversary usurped was the earth, and the second realm that God's going to usurp, or that God's going to reconcile to himself, is the earth. Okay? Now, in view of that, what we're going to be moving on, again, lesson number 3, we took a look at that mystery resurrection, the means by which God is going to reconcile the heavenly places back unto himself and have complete reconciliation and complete tit-for-tat judgment against the adversary to reclaim his dominion and his places there in the heavenlies. We're now going to look at the issue of the resurrections concerning the earth to reconcile the earth. Okay? And that brings us back to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, and look at verse 23. Again, but every man in his own order. In verse 23 and verse 24, we're not talking about the mystery resurrection. We're not talking about being caught up. That's not included in this. What Paul is referencing here is the Davidic covenant and the resurrection to fulfill the Davidic covenant. That the Christ, the seed of the woman, who's going to stem from man, he's going to be man, but by him is going to come the resurrection, and he's going to fulfill the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants, the new covenant, to bring about his purpose on this earth. That's what Paul's quoting and what he's bringing up, and he's bringing it up as the truth and the validity that is backed by all the law, the Psalms, and the prophets to verify to the Corinthians the reality that Christ did rise from the dead. He's using it as a piece of evidence that there is a resurrection, okay? Now, he brings up this order again, verse 23, Christ the firstfruits, afterward they that are Christ at his coming. Okay, that's what he's talking about right here. Number 3 here. And that issue when we saw in last lesson of Zechariah chapter 14, when he'll stand upon the Mount of Olives. The resurrection, this third resurrection here, takes place after he stands on the Mount of Olives, after he battles there at the Valley of Jehoshaphat, okay? And then you have this resurrection come into view. Then you have 1,000 years. Now, the 1,000 years is represented in 1 Corinthians 15 in verse 25 in the first 4 words, for he must reign, okay? But look at before that, look at verse 24. Then cometh the end. So those that are him at his coming, and what he does is he goes from this one, right here, to verse 24. He says, then cometh the end. When he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he shall have put down all rule and all authority and power. And in verse 25, what he does is he cycles back, and he's going to go through it again, and he says, for he must reign. That's the millennial kingdom. Till he hath put all enemies under his feet. He does not deliver the kingdom up to his Father until all enemies are under Christ's feet. Okay? Verse 26. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is what? Is death. When that last enemy is destroyed, or I should say there's a resurrection involved with that last enemy being destroyed. Verse 27, for he hath put all things under his feet. But when he saith all things are put under him, it is manifest that he, that's the Father, is accepted, which did put all things under Christ. And when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him, that's the Father, that put all things under him, that's Christ, that God may be all in all. There is design, there is purpose, there is order, there is prescription for the Son, whom all things is put under him, to subdue. And these resurrections, there's one on the front end and there's one on the back end. Now, let's take a look at those real quick. Come with me to John chapter 5. John chapter 5. This was something that is evident from the gospel accounts that many Israelites understood, or either they understood it prior to the Lord's teaching, or they understood it by the Lord's teaching. Look at John chapter 5 and come down with me to verse 28. He says, marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice and shall come forth. They that have done good unto the resurrection of what? Of life. And they that have done evil unto the resurrection of what? Those are the 2 resurrections. This is the resurrection of life, and this is the one to damnation. All right? Now come with me to Acts 24. Acts 24. And look at verse 14. He says, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the what? The unjust. Now, we're involved in the resurrection of the just. If you quickly come with me to 2 Timothy chapter 4, and look at verse 1. Look what he says here. He says, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick, those that are alive, and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom. Now, you have the just and the unjust, and you have those that are alive and remain and those that are dead. And we all, at our resurrection, at our judgment, there's a judgment that corresponds with each one of these resurrections. It's resurrection to judgment, essentially. Okay? All of us will be just. Come with me real quick to 1 Corinthians 3. Now, this is going into the issue of our resurrection and what takes place afterwards. But quickly come to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He's talking about building upon the foundation, and there's no other foundation than that which is Jesus Christ. He says, take heed how you build upon what you build with. Verse 13, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be what? Saved, yet so as by fire. He's saved because he's in the book of life, because he's just. The just shall live by faith. He's justified in the eyes of God. His works are being judged. Our works will be judged, but we'll be saved. We're just. So at our resurrection, in the air, in the heavenly places, all those that are there are just the just. Okay? Now there's a resurrection of this earth here, and what you're going to have is you're going to have just and unjust here. And if you can kind of see the pattern, guess who are going to be only at the great white throne resurrection? The unjust. Sorry, I can't really fit it in there. All right, now let's take a look at that. So I brought up Acts 24 there in verse 15, where it talked about the resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. Okay? Now come with me to Revelation chapter 20. Well, before we do that, I want to do one other thing. Come with me to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. I'm sorry, it's chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 14. There's two judgments here kind of brought up in regards to when the Lord returns. Look at verse 14 of Matthew 25. For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country. That's the issue of his death, burial, resurrection, and his ascension. He goes into his far country. Who called his own servants, so those that are justified, and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. Now his own servants are the nation of Israel there, okay? He says, then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same and made them 5 other talents. And likewise he that had received 2, he also gained the other 2. But he that had received 1 went and digged in the earth and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants cometh. So he returns and reckoneth with them. He's going to judge them. He's going to give an account. They're going to give an account of what they did with his goods. Verse 20. And so he that received 5 talents came and brought other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou deliverest unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord. He's going to make him a ruler in his kingdom. Goes on with the one that had received 2. The one who received 1 and hid it. Look at verse 24. Then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew thee that thou art an hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed. He shouldn't even thought that. And I was afraid and went and hid thy talent in the earth. Lo, there thou hast, that is thine. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed not, and gathered where I have not strawed. He judges him by his own thoughts about his Lord. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received mine own with usury. Take therefore the talent from him and give it unto him which hath 10 talents. So he gives it to the one that's 10, he gets 11. And in verse 30, he casts some into outer darkness. That's not hell. That's outside the kingdom. Now, that's part of the judgment with those that are just in the nation of Israel. Those that are unjust, they go to damnation, the apostate element of Israel. You have that whole issue when John the Baptist was here, when he was here on this earth, and so many came to his baptism, and many were baptized because they justified God in that they had sinned against God. And the issue of not experiencing the wrath on this earth, the whole issue of they'll be saved from it, or out of it, is what the remnant's supposed to have. But then you had the leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees, came to his baptism, and John says, Who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? They didn't think they were deserving his wrath. And he goes on and talks about this issue of Christ is going to separate the nation, his wheat that he gathers in his garner, and the chaff that he burns up. The apostate element of Israel, that national judgment, the believing remnant, they'll rewarded, some ruler over much, some not, some even cast out of the kingdom, yet they're still justified. But the unjust in the nation, they're the chaff that are going to be burnt up into everlasting fire and torment. So that's their judgment. That's what happens to them. But then part of the national judgment is he judges the nations. Verse 31. When the Son of Man shall come. So we see that issue in verse 27, at my coming, judges his own people. And then verse 31, Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him. Then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And he goes on and gives the standard of the judgment in connection with their works, especially in view of doing them the right way in connection with the remnant. And look at the outcome of that. Jump down all the way to the last verse, verse 46. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous unto what? Life eternal. Okay? Now, the reason why I bring that judgment up is because there's a resurrection involved in that. There's a resurrection involved in that. Come with me to Revelation 20. Particularly, but not only, the Israelites of old that had obtained a good report. Look at Revelation 20 and look at verse 5. Look at verse 4. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead, there were some of the dead that were resurrected, and that's who they see. But the rest of the dead lived not until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first, what? Resurrection. Now, the way in which he's going to describe the second resurrection, although it is a resurrection of sorts, it's identified as the second death. Okay? Look what he goes on to say, verse 6. Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power. So these are all those that are justified in the Old Testament that have died. They get resurrected. Okay? But they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, shall go out to deceive the nations, which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast in the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, which were thrown in there before the 1,000 years, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. One of the reasons why it's the great white throne that is oftentimes not understood, or even there's just no recollection of it, is the reason why it's the great white throne is because as you go through the 1,000 years, and remember, we saw in 1 Corinthians 15, he must reign until he put all things under his feet. That means all things are not under his feet during the 1,000 years, but more and more is going underneath his feet. And this final issue of the devil going into the lake of fire and brimstone is you have the final things going under his feet. And that's why it's this great white throne. It's manifesting his glory not just as God, that which it is, but it's manifesting the 1,000-year manifestation of his power and his reign and his authority, and really, like no other man could or woman could ever do before him, not even Adam, of subduing all things. He's the one that's been able to do it. And it takes him 1,000 years. I think it's interesting that oftentimes, especially now as we're going through this series, we're going through debacle of an election, in a whole election year. And we oftentimes in our fickle minds think that someone's going to change something in 4 years or 8 years if they get in their second term. It's going to take Christ 1,000 years to change this world, to subdue all things unto himself. It's going to take Christ, the Christ, to do that. Now, granted, he's dealing with spiritual things that no mere man can deal with by him or herself. But think about that. Those things are there in God's Word to help us to understand what's going on and what is not going to go on. But that's why it's a great white throne. Because he's getting to the end of this 1,000 years with putting now the devil in the lake of fire and brimstone. And he's about to destroy this last enemy, death, is because he's manifested his authority and his power and his reign to subdue 99% all things. The last thing that he needs to destroy is that last enemy, death. That's why it's the great white throne. And him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. They had already fled away. And there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. They were resurrected. They were delivered up. And the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which are written in the books according to their works. If you are judged according to your works without your name written in the book of life, you're in big trouble. If your name's written in the book of life and you're judged by your works, you'll be saved, yet so is by fire, at least. Verse 13, here it is. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it. And death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them. Here's this final resurrection. And they were judged every man according to his works, his judgment that follows. And death and hell were cast in the lake of fire. This is the second what? Christ is so victorious over death, yet he doesn't, in being victorious over death, he is not unjust to come along and simply just save everyone. No, he makes a second death that is more powerful than the first death. And he has power to do that because of his resurrection. This is that last and final resurrection, and he casts it all into the lake of fire and seals it off. And that's where he now has subdued all things, and he delivers up to his Father. And he says, Father, in view of you putting all things under my feet, and I have now subdued all things, according to that 1 Corinthians 15 passage, according to what you prophesied and what you made known and what you had prescribed for me to carry out, for me to be faithful in the law, the Psalms, and the prophets, and that were carried out in the gospel accounts historically, he's done. And the whole world is his, and the fullness thereof. And everything now, to the fullness of it, of the nth degree, praises him, because he destroys that last enemy, death. Those are the order of resurrections. Christ the first fruits of the fruit of more resurrection, the one being us being caught up, what God's doing today. That's the first one that follows Christ's resurrection in view of his tit-for-tat judgment against the adversary to reclaim and reconcile what was usurped from him. The third one then becomes the second one in 1 Corinthians 15. Them that are at his coming, both just and unjust are there. The specificity of Matthew 25, the judgment of his nation, the believing remnant and the apostate element, the wheat and the chaff, and then the rest of the nations, the sheep and the goats. Some can enter into life eternal, some into everlasting punishment. The 1,000 years, for he must reign until all things are put under his feet. Last enemy is death, and there is death and hell, deliver up their goods. That's emptied, and death itself, therefore, is destroyed. And it's all under Christ. That second death is under Christ, orchestrated by Christ, and put all those dead, all those unjust, into that lake of fire for all eternity. That's that second death. Separation, not from God, but separation from his glory. For the fire that burns eternally is a part of his holiness. The issue is that they experience it for all eternity. They experience that punishment, that condemnation for all eternity of the fire of his holiness. Whereas we, because Christ paid the debt and penalty of our sin, he through the eternal Spirit obtained eternal redemption, that we might attain an eternal inheritance. That's not only true of Israel, but for us as well. We were not touched by that fire of his holiness, but rather we experience the beauty of his holiness. And it's in view of that beauty of holiness that in our last lesson we're going to take a look at the glory of resurrection, primarily, although there's lots of glory associated with it, primarily as it concerns the body. And so we'll take a look at the bodily resurrection and the glory of it in our fifth and final lesson. I'm Josh Strzelecki, pastor and teacher of Twin Cities Grace Fellowship. Until the fifth and final lesson, look up.